I'll introduce myself. My name is Ian McConnell. I work for the World Wildlife Fund. I am our global coordinator for beef. So within that role, I tend to try and pull together the work that we do in beef right around the world, not only in the producing countries, many of those colleagues with whom you in the room work very closely with, but also the work we do in markets, consumption, and in emerging countries, whether they be in Africa, Asia, etc. It's an incredibly diverse role, and it's a role that I took on coming from the beef industry. I'm a sixth-generation beef producer from Australia. We run a 10,000-acre farm, a couple of thousand head of cattle on grass, a Droughtmaster breed, a proud Australian breed. Most of those traditionally have always been export cattle, but what we tend to do more often now is sell into our domestic market, and that's partly because of the work that the industry has done around assuring quality assurance through the MSA system and bringing in quality assurance systems that allow consumers to have trust in the product. What that meant for producers like us who were able to have early maturing cattle is that even though we had some Bos Indicus in them, we could actually start selling them domestically, which was an exciting piece of work for us to be able to do. It made a little bit more money for the farm, but it actually increased the area for which our domestic suppliers could purchase beef from in Australia. So one example of a pretty effective system where that traceability and sustainability work has been built into industry. Today I'm going to facilitate a panel on carbon and the role that the beef industry plays both as a solution and as a driver for climate change. And it's topical. It's a hot topic, if you pardon the pun. It's especially this week with the International Panel on Climate Change releasing their special report 115. That report highlights more than ever the urgency for actions right now. But interestingly, it's not just urgent action, it's urgent, strong action. And not just from government. It's something we're all going to have to begin to play a part in. Often when these discussions are had, and more than ever in those IPCC reports, this current report has begun to highlight the food system. The food system has been a major driver of ecological change on this planet for all of humanity's history. It will remain that way. But how we actually move into a space where those impacts are minimised and that ideally the food system becomes a positive driver for our planetary systems. Beef is one of the drivers of some of our greatest challenges. It is listed along other industries around deforestation, emissions, water. They are challenges we need to own up with, and I was encouraged speaking to Fritz Schneider, the chair of the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, when he made the remark yesterday to me that this is a discussion that seems so much more honest and open about these challenges, that through the Roundtable we're able to have these discussions. I was also very interested to listen to Justin yesterday morning from Rabo about the fact that we need to have ownership and leadership of these challenges if we're actually able to dictate in some way where the conversation goes. He also recognised that climate was the #1 threat that our industry is going to have to face through sustainability. And it's often thought of through different paradigms for us as industry. More often than not, we tend to take the defensive, that we have to communicate our role as a solution, we have to communicate the work that we are already doing, or communicate to farmers to help them reduce emissions. What's not often thought about is the impact that climate change is going to have on us and our ability to produce beef moving forward, especially in a place like Australia where we already have the most variable climate in the world and on the driest continent in the world. Things like climate change are going to drastically change the way we farm. More importantly, though, it's going to change the way the world's poorest farm. 2/3 of the world's poor are directly involved in livestock production. They're already in the most marginal areas climatically in soil. And if we don't deal with climate change, it is the world's poor, and most of those are livestock farmers that are going to be most drastically impacted. The realm of climate refugees and etc. is something that's already occurring. And if we don't play a role in helping that change, not only as an industry, but also for this industry, then we're actually going to hinder things like sustainable development as well as the profitability and sustainability of our developed country systems. Livestock, as I said, are 14.5% of human-induced carbon emissions. That's a significant chunk, and 65% of those are beef. One of the things we need to also be aware of in that is that if we move on energy, if we move to renewable systems, we don't get to 2 degrees if we don't tackle the livestock challenge also. So we need to be doing something to achieve our planetary goals. What the report, however, this week has highlighted is that 2 degrees may not be sustainable itself. We should be aiming for 1.5. So we've assembled a crack crew, a crew that's going to help us solve, or at least give us some ideas on how to solve these challenges, but also what's in it for us. So I'm going to introduce them one by one and allow them to give you a quick lightning talk. Their key messages that they want you to know. And I'll start with technology. It felt like a good, I thought it looked smart if I used technology. With Fabiana Villa Alves. Fabiana works for Embrapa in Brazil, an organisation known to anyone that's worked in innovation in livestock in Brazil. But specifically relevant to this panel is she's managing the carbon neutral beef project for Embrapa.
Thank you. It's okay? Okay. Thank you for the invitation. I will try to speak to you in this room about our project, a national project called the Carbon Neutral Brazilian Beef. That it's a concept brand based on silvopastoral systems. That in Brazil is nowadays is considered the most sustainable livestock production system, where we can put together trees, we can produce wood, we can produce biofuel, we can produce grains, and we can produce meat. And in these ambients that you know in the picture, we reforestate these lands, and in almost of the case, and we can restore value to these grasslands. And this concept brand, it's a commercial brand. We put together the producers, the farmers, and all the supply chain. We can link the producer to the meat retailers, as we done in Brazil in the last weeks. When a big company from Brazil, the second company in Brazil for the meat production, the Global Food Marfrig, reached us and put together with us in this brand. So I will show you how we are working in Brazil, how Brazil is coping with its livestock decarbonization. Previously, in the previous section, we heard that we needed to have best practice in the field, and we needed to have a pasture management program, and we have this in Brazil. We are putting more sustainable into the pastures and into the production systems, beef production systems, with the increasing use of the best agricultural practices. And with this, we can reduce the emissions of the carbon and also to sequestration carbon into these well-managed pastures. And so the ask that we asking every day is less beef for more, is necessary less beef for more world sustainability? We think there is not the question, because we have a lot of field trials and scientific finds that when we have this kind of systems, we can improve the sustainability in the grass-fed beef. When we are talking about carbon-neutral Brazilian beef, we're talking of integrated systems, integrated crop, livestock, forest systems that increased in Brazil 6 times in the last 10 years. And nowadays we have about 12 million of hectares in entire Brazil, entire territory, with this kind of systems. And this is an opportunity to give more added value to the beef produced in this kind of systems. And this concept brand brings this view. When we compare this kind of systems with the traditional systems based on pastures, we have, I highlighted these 2 benefits, okay? Animal welfare, a high animal welfare, and the mitigation of GHG. High animal welfare because in Brazil, I think the biggest problem with regard to animal welfare is the thermal comfort for the animals, because we have a high level of thermal stress on the field, on the pastures, because we have a high radiation, a high amount of radiation, of solar radiation, and brings to the animals this thermal discomfort. And when we have trees, we have a decrease from 2 to 9 degrees centigrade in air temperature due to the shadow. The shadow decrease of 80% of solar radiation. And we have that we call a high level of welfare for these animals. And so we can store about, in these 12 millions of hectares, we can store about 35 megatonnes of CO2 equivalents, mainly on the trunks, because we have these trees put into the pastures. It's a sink, it's a store, can store the CO2. So we have a less 55% of GHG emissions and into a 6 times less area. So when we can see these dates, we can see the opportunity for this brand, for the carbon neutral Brazilian beef, or in Portuguese, carne carbono neutro. And we have also additional benefits. We have welfare, we have GHG reduction, GHG sequestration, but we have also a diversity of production. We can produce maize, soybean, rice, pear millet. We can produce biofuel and wood, and we can conserve soil and water. And we have at least 20% of less consumption of the water in this kind of systems. And we make the called effect save land. We can produce more into a less of area. So this is the brand. is a carbon neutral Brazilian beef label, also in Portuguese and in English. And it's a concept trademark developed by Embrapa. Embrapa is a Brazilian Agricultural Research Corporation, founded by the Ministry of Livestock and Agriculture, aiming to certify beef whose respective GHG emissions were mitigated during the production process by the presence of the trees. So we needed to have this kind of system, the silvopastoral systems or the agro-silvopastoral systems. It's a certified brand, so we can measure, we can relate, and we can verify the numbers. We can verify this, the data output from these systems. We developed also an app for the farmer to facilitate the farmer to achieve this brand and to know if he is able to receive this brand of with their systems. And we have also a protocol based on guidelines that are based on the EPCC methodology.
Sorry, rather than go into the details now, we might let people ask questions about the details as we go through those, and just so we can get through the lightning talks.
Okay.
And I want to make sure, just be clear, we don't have the app for questions. We'll be doing old school mic questions. So if you've got questions, start making notes, and when we finish the lightning talks, we'll go straight to the audience with questions. So I'll now introduce Dr. Sara Place. Sara has a background as a professor in sustainable beef systems and has researched measuring methane from cattle. She now actually works for NCBA managing the Chekhov's sustainability programs in the US.
Thank you, Ian, for the introduction. And I think maybe you have the clicker still. Oh, sorry. So no worries. Thank you. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the introduction. I would like to just give you a very quick overview of some of the research that we're doing at National Cattlemen's, looking at the total impact from a carbon perspective for the U.S. beef industry. So you heard earlier today, if you were at the morning session, and heard from Debbie kind of a little bit about the structure of the U.S. beef industry. We do have a wide array of production in the United States, and we are the #1 beef producer in the world, right? So we produce roughly about 18% of the world's beef with about 8% of the world's cattle herd. So in terms of the research that we've been doing, we've been kind of taking a regionalized approach in doing life cycle assessment, which is essentially an environmental accounting system across the entire supply chain of beef. And some of this information I'm going to share with you all today is really what we call Cradle to Farmgate. So looking at all the impacts of feed production, from fertilizer use to any emissions from the soil itself, through to emissions from the animals, right? And so those are those environmental footprints that we're looking at. And in terms of how we broke up the United States, you all can see the different regions of the U.S. Broken out on the screen, kind of roughly where we have major geographical distinctions. So we have a lot of variation within the U.S. in terms of elevation changes, precipitation gradients across the whole country. So in terms of those high-level results, this is probably not too surprising for most of you in the room. Essentially what you're looking at here is a pie chart showing where those emissions, those CO2 equivalent emissions, come from the U.S. beef industry from cradle to farm gate. And down at the bottom are kind of our regional averages. So we have a fair amount of regional variation, from 17 to 27 kilos of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilo of carcass weight. Interestingly enough, we tend to see more variation within regions of the United States even than across. So there is a lot of variability that is out there. The single biggest contributor to our carbon footprint from cradle to farm gate is enteric methane, right? The so-called Burps that this session is named after, right? So 56% of our emissions are enteric methane. Another significant chunk are nitrous oxide emissions that come from croplands and from any grazing land soils, and so that can be originating from cattle manure or from fertilizer inputs onto those soils. Just to orient you, upstream CO2 is really that thinking about electricity or upstream fertilizer impacts, right? We try to take that all into account, as well as any tractors, any fossil fuel burning that takes place on the operation is all accounted for in this number. So what that looks like from a whole U.S. perspective, we tried to essentially weight beef production around the U.S. based on those different regions and those footprints that we have. So our national footprint, accounting for all feed production, for all these upstream impacts, is about 243 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents in the United States. And so it's kind of hard to compare that to the EPA's inventory because we're using the more up-to-date IPCC global warming potentials for methane and nitrous oxide, so it's not a perfect comparison to the EPA inventory. But in terms of our methane emissions and our manure emissions, we're really close to what the EPA's estimate is. So we feel pretty good that our scaling there is pretty accurate. This pie chart just shows kind of where our emissions are coming from in the U.S. Again, for those that are familiar with the United States, it's not too surprising. Southern Plains kind of stands out. We have a lot of cattle there in terms of both beef cows, and a lot of cattle are finished there. And then in the southeastern United States, a significant portion of the beef cow herd is in that region. And again, so that's a lot of our enteric methane emissions. And then I know there's a lot of interest in carbon sequestration, and we just heard some of the great work that's happening in Brazil. So I just kind of wanted to point out again that we have a lot of geographic variability within the United States in terms of land use types and precipitation gradient across the U.S. So this map that you're looking at now is from the American Farmland Trust, and it's using USDA data of the different types of land use we have in the United States and essentially mapping it out. So if you can't see the scale at the bottom, our dark green colors are where our cropland is in the United States. So again, for those familiar, the Mississippi River Valley, the U.S. Corn Belt really stands out. In the eastern U.S., we have more forested lands. And then in the western U.S., especially from about the 100th meridian west, is a lot of our rangelands in the United States. So rangeland makes up a significant portion of the landmass of the United States. And most of that land is quite arid, right? Especially places in the intermountain west that are really desert. And so I just put that out there because it is it's difficult to say what our carbon sequestration is. To be honest, in those numbers I just showed you for our carbon footprint, we assume carbon equilibrium. We're not accounting for carbon sequestration in pastures because it's really hard to extrapolate across the U.S. But I was inspired by a lot of this carbon neutral stuff I heard yesterday, so I just did some literal back of the envelope calculations yesterday. So again, take these with a grain of salt. Conservatively, we have about 336 million acres of grazing land in the United States. So if we look at those couple rates of carbon sequestration that are out there in the peer-reviewed literature, you all can see kind of what that scales up to in terms of million metric tons of CO2. So in the most optimistic case, right, if we're at that 0.28 megagrams of carbon, we could potentially be cutting our emissions in half, right, of what I showed you earlier. But again, this is with a healthy dose of salt, right, into these numbers. But just to give you an idea of what that might look like. And so with that, thank you very much.
Simon Miller. Simon has a background in agricultural consultancy and agricultural support, but now is the General Manager of the Cool Farm Alliance, an alliance that manages the Cool Farm tool. So I'll let Simon explain more.
Great, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. So I've been managing the Cool Farm Alliance, which is a not-for-profit member organisation, which started in 2008 with Unilever. You may have heard of it. They were looking for the carbon footprint of the raw materials that they were sourcing in their supply chain. And from there's been a steady growth. Other corporates have got on board and said, actually, we've got the same challenges, we need the same things. Rather than us doing it unilaterally, let's join forces and come together to develop a tool which can be used in all of our supply chains. And what are the drivers? Well, the big one really is off the back of COP21, tremendous interest obviously in the food sector, realising just how much of emissions is coming from agriculture. Keith from McDonald's earlier mentioned science-based targets and their commitment. Many of our members also have this commitment, so very ambitious goals to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, which lead to their supply chains quite quickly. UN SDGs is also a driver. And then more practically, bottom left there, looking at the state of farmland, looking at the state of soil, realising that existing practices aren't sustainable in the long term, needing to change what's happening on the ground. And then the sort of other side of that coin is the bottom right, regenerative agriculture, agroforestry, those organisations that are doing really novel, innovative techniques, and they want to demonstrate just how beneficial that is in carbon terms. Very useful to follow Sara, because what we do is very similar in terms of the results, the breakdown of the emissions from different parts of the farm. But the big difference really from the Cool Farm Tools point of view is that we're farmer focused. This can be very academic, can be very technical, it can be very difficult to understand. And our theory of change is we want to bring these principles to farmers directly. So they use the tool, they interact with it, it's manageable, it's not overly complicated, and they can see the results of different changes they make, different data they input. So that's our first principle, being farmer focused. And I should add also the tool is free for farmers. So farmers anywhere in the world can log on, set up an account and start using it. Again, we're trying to get it out there, get as many farmers using it as possible. But we are science-based. I suspect we'll talk about methods in this panel shortly. So we worked with a number of universities to develop our methods. So the beef module was developed by the team at Wageningen in the Netherlands, and then we have Aberdeen, we have Oxford, Cambridge. So these are the guys developing our independent methods which sit within the software. Thirdly, we're industry-backed. As I've said, the idea is to come together rather than asking farmers to do lots of different things from different customers. If there's a focus there, a single ask, it makes it a lot simpler for the farmers. And to that end, we have a partnership with SciPlatform, where our metrics are something that they're putting forward to their members. Fourth one is crops and livestock. For the big global multinationals, they have this challenge. They're sourcing all over the world, and they may be sourcing livestock products, crop products. There's different tools in different geographies. They've got this huge headache. How do you bring that together to have a single view of the carbon profile of their supply chains? So the Cool Farm tool, we started in crops. We've introduced dairy a couple of years ago and beef more recently. So we're looking to service all of those needs. And the last point there is obviously global. Not sure how much of this you can see, but this is our membership. It's probably slightly out of date now. We've got about 50 corporate members. Key founders were PepsiCo, Tesco, Unilever. More recently, Danone and Nestle have come in to look at dairy. McDonald's are on board as well. M&S. So we've got a very good representation. We also have a number of the agri-input organisations involved. Their interest is to get accurate numbers around mineral fertilisers and the different efficiencies that exist there. And we also have the NGO community involved as well. So we have this very good community of different organisations coming together to focus on the development of a tool which can be used by farmers everywhere. Just very briefly, the history. So it started in 2008. We went online in 2012 to develop the Cool Farm tool, and the alliance was formed. In 2016, we added a biodiversity calculator to the greenhouse gas tool. Last year, we went multilingual, so French, Spanish, Dutch, German, along with the English version of the tool. And we launched our dairy module then and water module. And the dairy module is built from the IDF, the International Dairy Federation method, which some of you may be aware of. And then just this year, beef has gone live, and we've built what we call API connections. So this is the ability to link our software to other farm software. So farmers don't need to enter data manually, but they can get those software systems to talk to one another. And I think this is my last slide, but just to show this is what it looks like. So this is a screenshot from the new released interface. So along the top there, you have the tabs. You put in information about the herd, grazing, feed, manure, energy and transport. On the right-hand side there, you have live results. So as the farmer puts in a bit of data, that updates immediately. So there's not this delay. It's not a consultant sending a report 3 weeks later. They see the results in real time. One perhaps unique feature of our tool is that because we have this crop module, and that's where we've done so much work historically, a farmer, if they're growing, let's say, maize silage on their farm, they're doing that particularly efficiently, they can go through, they can do a footprint for that maize silage, and then use that as an input to the beef tool. So we're trying to make this an integrated system and really reward best practice, which might be going on the feed side as well as on the beef finishing side. That's it.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is a bit of a superstar in this space. He's worked in LEAP. He's actually a chair of one of the technical expert working panels of LEAP at the moment, the FAO's. I'll let him introduce what LEAP is, actually, rather than try and quickly remember the acronym myself. More interestingly, though, his involvement in the International Panel on Climate Change saw him recognised in 2007 when they won the Nobel Peace Prize. So, ladies and gentlemen, Tim McAllister.
Thanks a lot, Ian. I guess I'm a superstar that didn't show up with any slides, so I'm just going to wing it here. I think some of the points I want to make is I want to make the point that the science of sustainability is very complicated. And we come up with these numbers, and I think often people don't realize the uncertainty that's associated with many of these numbers. And basically, even on the IPCC, when we would sit around the table and come up with the methodologies, you know, there would be places where there would be virtually no information in the literature. And it basically then came down to 5 or 6 people, so-called experts, sitting around the table, where they would have to come up with a number, and they would pick the best number that they could come up by through consensus. And those are still the foundations of many of the calculations that we're making today. And I don't think many people realize that. The other thing I want to emphasize is that one of the reasons why it's complicated is because we're always talking mostly about cycles here. And when we talk, and I think many people in general society don't realize, they think that if cows consume water, then that water disappears. Well, it doesn't disappear at all. It just takes another form. And so when we're looking at transformation between different compounds, there's many things that affect that transformation in terms of how quickly it occurs, what the fluxes are, and all of those are very complicated calculations to do accurately. And so we have a lot of uncertainty. If we take carbon, for example, carbon dioxide can be in one form, you know, that's the one we're concerned about from a global warming perspective. But carbon can be, we talk about HN carbon, you know, that's the fossil fuels that are really probably the crux of the problem that we're facing in terms of climate change. We have deep carbon, shallow carbon, long-term carbon, you know, liable carbon. So there's many different forms of carbon. Methane is also part of the carbon cycle. We talk about how we're not uncertain in terms of the half-lives of many of these gases in the atmosphere. All of those are basically, there are assumptions that are made. They come up with a number. Since I've been with the IPCC, the global warming potential of methane has changed 3 times. And it keeps going up. So it looks like the emissions from cattle are going up. Well, it's just because they're changing that number. So all of those things influence the overall estimates that we come up with. If we, you know, in this case, we're talking about carbon, but when we're talking about carbon equivalents, we're also considering nitrogen in those estimates when we talk about nitrous oxide. And the nitrogen cycle is even more complicated than the carbon cycle is. We have nitrogen gas, the major gas in the atmosphere. We have ammonia, which is often produced in feedlots when we're talking about the degradation of protein. That ammonia can be converted to nitrate or nitrite. Nitrate can have a major negative impact on groundwater quality, but it can also be an excellent nitrogen source for plant growth. We end up with nitrous oxide or nitrous dioxide, different forms that also are greenhouse gases that can contribute to the overall climate change as well. So all of those conversions that take place, we've had a lot of interest and a lot of talk around carbon sequestration. There's a lot of unknowns about carbon sequestration as well. If we look at, you know, when we talk about carbon sequestration, generally ecosystems tend to move towards a state of equilibrium over time, unless that ecosystem becomes disrupted by some event, such as climate change can have an impact on that. So the amount of carbon sequestration is going to differ dramatically depending upon the environment that you're dealing with. I can tell you back home when I left Calgary, there wasn't a lot of carbon sequestration going on because it was all under 6 inches of snow. So we don't have a lot of carbon sequestration happening in Canada in the wintertime, nor do we have a lot of carbon emission because the ground's frozen and there's not a lot of microbial activity going on there that's releasing the carbon. We often lose sight as well of the disturbances that can lead to increased emissions. A good example, I was sitting thinking about where we heard some of the discussions about what's going on in South America in terms of the mandate of maintaining a certain amount of forest in each of the farms. One could ask the question, why don't we have a similar mandate in the North American prairies for the maintenance of grasslands? Why don't we have 10 to 20% grassland that's mandated to be maintained in those areas that have been cultivated since the 1900s? So those, when we talk about carbon in that aspect, we know one thing for sure, it's a lot easier to emit carbon than it is to sequester it. When we see those differences, when we try to put a science on that and try to summarize those things from a global perspective, I think a lot of those assumptions in that are lost in the numbers that we come up with at the end. We're basically forced to come up with some kinds of numbers. We do the best that we can, but there's definitely lots of improvement. The last thing I would say is that I think that when we make promises, because this whole sustainability thing is really about trust and gaining social license, we have to make sure that those promises are scientifically realistic. If they're not, and we make those promises and we fail to deliver, that could have negative consequences on the whole idea that we're trying to achieve through sustainability. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. Our next panelist is Claus Deblitz. Claus is an agricultural economist with the ThÄnen Institute of Farm Economics from Braunschweig in Germany, and he's the manager of the Agri-Benchmark project in beef and sheep, and more recently pigs, one of the world's largest benchmarking projects of economics, environmental and sustainability indicators around the world.
Thanks to everybody. Yeah, a few words about this Agri-Benchmark. I was asked to mention it. We work, it's a global network coordinated by our institute, and we work closely with agricultural economists, producers, advisors and local experts, and we have several branches, among them beef and sheep, pigs, cash crops, horticulture, organic and fish in this. The beef and sheep network that I coordinate has 35 member countries, and we generate, analyze and hopefully improve databases of production systems, their economics, framework conditions and perspectives on an annual basis. So that's the infrastructure part of the project. And apart from this part, we also use our methods, experience, data and tools for specific projects and questions like the analysis of more sustainable production systems. So how to get from one situation to another, which I used to call practice change. So I'm a little bit attached to Latin America because we have done quite some work here, because I looked into some stats and found quite interesting. Latin America has 25% of global cattle inventory, 25% of global beef production, and 25% of global beef exports. But it has a much higher proportion of global GHG emissions from cattle, if we believe the present enteric fermentation rates. And 70% of the grassland is considered to be degraded. So there seems to be a need in these more or less low productive grazing systems for action. And our approach is actually to have a rather comprehensive approach, which actually on the farm level, which we deal with, includes productivity, economics, environment, among them emissions and biodiversity, animal welfare. I was glad to hear that in Fabiana's talk, as well as social aspects. The social aspects like small producers, working conditions, and low-income households have not been covered yet by us. And the second main point is actually we should look at the entire supply chain, which we don't do at the moment simply because of resources, but I'm happy to partner with people who do that. So our analysis focuses on measuring the metrics of different farming situations where we use our network. We have done work in Latin America, in Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, Paraguay, the latter two ones within a WWF-funded projects, and we are now expanding our activities to Brazil together with Fabiana in very short time. And we always, we had a look at silvopastoral systems mainly, And we basically always analyze a reference situation, which would be a traditional grazing system and a silvopasture system. And the good message you see there is, this is a slide from a presentation I did in a climate change conference recently in Berlin. So there is a potential to create multiple wins with silvopastoral systems. And we have some results from these systems. This is one of our case studies we did here in Colombia in the Caribbean region, where we have basically a result of higher grass yields, higher forage qualities, higher stocking rates, better usage of existing grass growth. Then it turns into the animal part, like higher feed availability, higher feed intake, higher digestibility, higher animal growth rates, better fertility, less mortality, and at the end, higher land productivity, as you can see on some of these charts. And it also turns into higher profitability. This is the chart on the right bottom there, not to the very right, that's the emission. But you see that it goes down for some years, and then it goes up to unprecedented levels. In terms of emissions, you see the right-hand chart. The change in emission levels vary depending on the reference unit. Basically, on a per hectare basis of the land used, it increases because we have higher stocking rates and more production. On a per animal basis, it remains usually the same or becomes even less, and it definitely becomes less in most of the cases on a per kilogram produced basis. And in some cases, also on a per hectare basis, we might observe a reduced level of biodiversity. But the most important message is we can produce the same amount of beef from less land. So now the core question is, what are we going to do with that land? And that's where, of course, some issues and policy comes in. First, to make it happen, this kind of transition needs investments and maybe some support, as well as know-how to manage these rotational systems, especially for small farmers. And I think here governments and international donors can play an important role. Second, of course, there is always the threat that we provide a fantastic system and can measure it's great to the producers, and they say, great, we do this on all the land and then cut the rest of the forest too, if they are allowed. So these rebound effects, of course, they have to be handled somehow by good governance, which means policy and institutional framework, that this really happens. And another point is, what are we actually really doing on this on this released land? So my conclusion is, if you want to maintain production levels that we have and at the same time reduce GHG emissions, you have to probably increase stocking rates. And otherwise, some people might say you might also turn into other herbivores like monogastric animals instead of ruminants. Thank you.
Thank you, Claus.
It's your turn.
The next speaker, Pip, probably needs no introduction, not only because she's well known, especially to us Australians, but she's already spoken on a number of panels this week. Pip comes obviously with a unique perspective working in the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework and managing that initiative in Australia on perhaps why an industry should do this and how an industry may attempt to drive change towards carbon neutrality or at least reduced emissions. She has an interesting background in journalism, corporate affairs, before moving over to the beef industry. Thanks, Pip.
Thanks, Ian. And I think that's a bit unfair to say that I'm relatively well known, and I think I'm definitely the least qualified on this panel here today to be talking about the topic. But as one of the few Australians that's made the journey over here, I guess I get the honour of talking about our very ambitious target to be carbon neutral by 2030. So I guess why did the Australian industry go ahead and set such a target? It did it to both address a key risk and an emerging concern from consumers, and I guess the likelihood that some of our export markets are talking about and in future might set up carbon taxes. But as Justin from Rabobank yesterday talked to, we've done it really to try and capture what we see as an opportunity. It's the opportunity for us to remove wastage from the system. So methane production is lost productivity, so if we can figure out how to remove that, that's improved productivity for producers. It's the opportunity to gain new income streams and diversify farming businesses through the emergence of carbon farming. And I guess importantly, it's the opportunity to align with the values of today's and importantly tomorrow's consumers. So I guess in Australia, there is carbon farming, And whilst we don't have a price on carbon yet, we have been lucky that an emissions reduction fund has been established. And they've set up something called ACCUs, or Australian Carbon Credit Units, and they're currently selling for about $12 a tonne. And since it was launched, I think 65% of the ACCUs have been claimed by the beef industry, and that's out of a $2.5 billion market. So it's a potential revenue stream that's already being realised by those producers. In addition, there's also a voluntary market for companies wishing to offset their emissions, and again, livestock grazing is playing a large part in those credits. I guess Claus was just talking about, potentially grazing across less landscape. In Australia, we don't really see that as the solution for our production system. We manage about 47% of the landscape, and most of that is unable to be used for any other type of food production. So we really see ourselves as active stewards of that land and operating within the natural ecosystem, and both maintaining and where possible also enhancing biodiversity. So I guess our target, where was it set? And we don't want to make promises that we talked about that can't be realised and set ourselves up for failure. And it's clearly an ambitious target. But it wasn't just something we kind of plucked out of the air. So the target came from the Australian lead research organisation, is called the CSIRO. And what they did firstly is to establish a baseline for us. So we've had probably about 10 years of undertaking life cycle assessments, but we wanted to look at aligning it with the national inventory, which then obviously goes through to the global climate reporting. So the emission was set at looking at both the emissions out from the industry as well as land use change related emissions, and that set the baseline. And then following this, what the report authors did is they got the input from about 80 leading academics in the area to look at what are the most promising practices that they see to both reduce and sequester carbon in the future. So some of the pathways included things like planting legumes in the systems, and we've already got quite a well-established Lucina production system in Australia, which has shown to reduce emissions by about 20%, but importantly at the same time as improving productivity by 23%. A continued focus on genetics, breeding more productive animals, but also looking at, are there traits that we can breed for to select for lower emitting animals. Also red asparagus or red algae. It's a huge opportunity. Our research over the last 10, 12 years in reducing methane has shown a potential to reduce by 80 to 90% with adding red asparagus into the diet. But I guess the challenge for us is the commercialisation of that and the practicality of getting it out to such an extensive industry. Vegetation clearly plays a role, both in maintaining vegetation and revegetating, and that has productivity improvements as well with things like shelter belts. And a personal favourite of mine, one of the pathways, is the important work that our little dung beetles do for us. So that's kind of the pathways that we're putting together. So the announcement was made about a year ago. In the next month, we're going to be getting sign-off from industry on what we're calling our implementation plan for CN30, which obviously has a short, medium, kind of long phase to get to that target. But there are a number of assumptions and things that need to happen, including government policy to support it, clearly the funding into continued research, and we're kind of lucky with the way our industry works with our levy system, that we do have about 12 years research into reducing methane emissions, and a lot of our projects in the pipeline are looking at how can we set up further methodologies under that emissions reduction fund I talked about earlier to reward landholders for doing great work. So the methodologies that we've got up at the moment are around vegetation management, so replanting obviously, in the north, savanna burning, so burning the landscape early in the season to prevent those really big hot fires that we get up in those really northern parts of the country, as well as herd management, so changing the way you're running your business. So I guess time's up, says the sign. So I guess to finish, it is an ambitious target for us, but it's one that we think will both secure the trust of tomorrow's consumer, but importantly provide a diversified revenue stream for our industry. So I might just end there, I guess.
Thanks, Pip. Now, we have around 40 minutes for questions, and we want to make sure that most of those questions come from you. I've got a few questions, some of which I've discussed with the panel, but that makes it a bit easy for them. So we do have a roaming microphone, so happy to take questions, discussions. Oh, we got one over there.
Hi, I wanted to ask on the case of the Brazilian carbon neutral, what percentage of the beef production of Brazil is carbon neutral overall? And do you have any projections as to how do you go bigger and bigger, and do you see possibility that this could be 100%, or is that unachievable? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the question. I will try to answer you. And we have, as I showed, we have about 12 millions of hectares in the main of region, in the most important region of Brazil for the production for the meat. And we calculated that about 10% of the entire beef it will be produced with in the systems. But we will launch the commercial protocol at January in the next year. We have now in Brazil only pilot projects with this kind of meat. And with with our new partner, Marfrig Foods, we will launch this in the commercial level. And we think that this beef, this brand, is for the external public. It's not for internal consumption. But in Brazil, we have this integrated systems is spread over all the territory, but it's not similar because we have 5 biomes, and we have a lot of trees and a lot of species, and with eucalyptus and brachiaria grass and Nelore, that is the focus of the carbon neutral Brazilian beef. We think the Midwest region that will be the target of this brand.
Jerzy Wierzbicki, Polish Beef Association. I have a question regarding the methodology, how we count the gas emission per carcass weight, per 1 kilo carcass weight. We have at the count the gas emission from the livestock, the bull or heifer or steer, and also we have at the count the gas emission from the suckler cows. Yes, and my question is, what is the percentage in the 1 kg of carcass, the gas emission of the suckler cow and the gas emission of this animal, what was slaughtered? And the next question, when we are going to the milk, the calves, what they are going from the milk production, how you divide the gas emission to the milk production and to the calf production? And did you compare the 1 kg emission to the carcass weight produced from the calf born from the dairy cow and the beef cow? Thank you.
Sara, you've done that, and then also, Tim, your view after Sara on the guidelines that LEAP is providing on some of that allocation.
Yeah, so in terms of kind of how that breaks out between the cow herd versus, say, feedlots, I didn't show that, but the majority of those emissions are coming from the cow herd itself, right? And that probably makes sense based on what I showed you with the enteric methane, right? And actually, most of it is coming from that source. And so we have more of our animals in that sector of our beef industry in the United States, and that's pretty much true around the world. And those animals tend to be eating a higher fiber diet, right? So they can be emitting a little bit more methane as compared to animals who are eating a grain-based diet in a feed yard. And so in terms of how we base that, we look at total carcass weight production from all phases of the beef supply chain, so both the terminal animals and any of the animals that would be culled throughout that whole process. In terms of how the numbers that I showed you, we are accounting for the dairy industry in the U.S., I think in the United States, it's probably a much lower % of our beef that comes from dairy as compared to especially in Europe, right? And so it's about 20% of the U.S. beef supply, both between cold dairy cows and all of our Holstein steers that mostly end up in the beef supply chain now. Most of the male dairy calves will end up as beef cattle. In terms of how we allocate that, and Dr. McAllister is much more of an expert in terms of talking about some of these things, but allocation can be done in many different ways. We use kind of more of a biophysical approach that actually puts most of the burden of the pregnancy and all the cow impacts on the dairy industry. Right, so when we account for dairy beef, that lowers our carbon emissions because some of those emissions of the cow, most of the emissions of the cow have been allocated to dairy, right? And sometimes when you look at those global assessments of beef impacts, usually Western Europe looks pretty low, and sometimes it's because there's a high percentage of the total beef that's coming from dairy, right? So that allocation happens between the two segments of the industry.
Yeah, I'd agree with those points when you're talking about dual purpose. If you divide the emissions up amongst milk and meat, then the total emissions for any one of those is lower than if you just looked at each of them singularly. When we did our studies in Canada, and usually, the recommendations are made that the allocation is based on the nature of the industry that you're trying to assess. And in Canada, we have our dairy industry is relatively small compared to the amount of meat that we produce from our beef industry. But we also have a very small veal industry, so many of those calves end up going into our feedlots. So in the analysis we did, we adjusted that for the Canadian system, and we included those calves coming from dairy animals as being part of the meat production system. So that's why there can be differences in those numbers depending upon how the LCA is set up and how those items are allocated. The one key thing is that, the recommendations from the LCA rulers is that those parameters are clearly described in the documents that are accompanying the LCA analysis, so that's clear to the reader.
I might just add, from our experience, we did our dairy module first, and the IDF, the International Dairy Federation, has its own rules on allocation, which I suspect may place slightly more of the burden to the spent calves to the beef side than to milk. So we've got a nettle to grasp at some stage where we make the beef and the dairy module consistent in that allocation. And I guess that each industry has its own incentives to sort of adjust that figure up and down accordingly.
Tim, does LEAP have a goal of developing methodology framework?
Yeah, it does, but I think sort of those comments I made about clearly describing the methodology and that's employed depending upon the production system as part of the recommendation. LEAP is not trying to mandate, it all must be done in this way. There is flexibility in their guidelines as well.
Question up the back, and then we'll come down the front.
Thank you. As a tenant farmer, in other words, somebody who doesn't own land but rents land, I wondered if any of the panel and any of the projects that they've been doing have extended their work into quantifying that value of improving the land and biodiversity and the things we've talked about, such that it can actually get built into a land rental agreement. I'd love to be able to get my rent down with my landlord and get recognition for all of this good work. Is anybody familiar with any of that sort of thing happening? I think it's particularly important actually because certainly in this part of the world we are going to see a structural change in land ownership and land management, and it may become increasingly important over the next few years.
I'll start with Claus, because it's something you guys have measured in your project, but I'd be interested, Pip, also in Australia, if you are, say, a tenant farmer, to use that term in Australia, and using a practice that is, sequestering carbon, therefore getting the carbon units, does the owner of the land get those, and hence it may be a rental negotiation, or does the manager get it?
I believe the owner gets it, but I haven't heard any situations where it's a tenant for our projects that are under the ERF.
Claus?
Yeah, we haven't really addressed this question in the same way that you asked it. But let's say in general, when you look at European subsidies like the direct payments now, it's actually the producer who gets them and not the landlord. first. But then we know that everything that you pay on a per hectare base is transferred into the land price. So there's always a transmission. So useless to pay this subsidy. Second, if you look at environmental schemes, for example, they usually have to calculate the payment on a per hectare base for the services that these schemes the producer provides. They usually have a cost component, and then they might have an incentive component, but that has become much closer. So what they got compensated for is basically the additional cost of not doing certain things or doing good things for the environment or however. So if we applied this to our calculations that we did, we could actually, it's becoming very complex, yeah, because we have to consider first the land that we manage, and assuming that we don't produce more, we set some land free, and that creates another value, and that could be basically turned into decrease your payments because you increase the asset value of the land by this for selling it. But I haven't gone into this in detail, to be honest, and I think it's going to be an awfully complex thing with a lot of assumptions again that has to be defended.
Fabiana, in your project, and extending on from that question, some of the extra benefits of going carbon neutral and the biodiversity, animal welfare, has there been an exploration, maybe not through rental negotiations, but payment for environmental services or other premiums around the other claims that are being measured?
No, not now. In Brazil, we don't have this kind of approach, but we have all the databases from of this to quantify these plus services. For example, for ecosystems services, as Kyle told in the previous session, we found that we have more birds, more more big mammals, more biodiversity, more welfare, more water store. And in this case, with this brand, with this concept brand, we wanted to crystallize all the scientific finds into a brand that helps the farm and help also the consumer to facilitate to see these plus services.
Thank you. Justin Sherrard from Rabobank. I have a question mainly for Tim, but I'd be interested in implications from other members of the panel. Tim, you mentioned the IPCC has changed the global warming potential of methane, the measurement base there 3 times. Can you give us a sense of where you see the discussion around methane cycles and measurement and etc. going? I mean, it's a massive issue for the beef industry. The fact that the emissions go up simply because you change the warming potential leads me to say, well, okay, if it goes down, then we do nothing and suddenly the impact goes down. But where's your sense of where it's going? And then I'd welcome views from the panel on what that might mean for their programs and measurement systems. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to realize the IPCC is a very big organization. And to be honest, I think when it comes from the agricultural perspective, we have very little influence over those atmospheric type of calculations. That's mainly the atmospheric scientists. You know, there are scientists across all of those areas that are experts in their fields as it relates to the IPCC. So as a fellow with expertise in beef farming, if I tell the atmospheric experts that they should rethink their methane calculations, they pretty much say, well, you should probably just stick to thinking about beef, you know. So those are some of the issues. I think that many people, me included, when I was involved in that, I had no idea when I was actually on that committee of the significance of what we were doing at that time. I don't think anybody did, actually, in terms of how important climate change was going to be coming and what was going to mean to the world. So there was a lot of assumptions, and you know, if I was back then there and I knew more or as much as I do now, I certainly would have been much more boisterous in many of the points I was making, and one of the ones that I would definitely really push now, and we're still going to try to push this one, is around considering the age of carbon that is really being released. When we talk about methane, it's still short-term carbon. You know, methane was previously a plant that season before the animal consumed it, right? Which is very different from the ancient carbon that's associated with fossil fuels, and I think many of us would still agree, really the crux of the problem that we're facing. So there should be some differentiation between short-term carbon and ancient carbon in terms of what it means in terms of its contribution to climate change, and that differentiation is not there yet.
Any other views from the panel?
Yeah, I think it was mentioned earlier, that paper that came out of Oxford, and my understanding is also kind of cursory because I'm an animal scientist, not a climate scientist, but that was a suggestion on how to account for global warming potentials a little bit differently. And thinking about, you know, some of the things that Dr. McAllister just mentioned about the short-term nature of methane and the realization that it is cycling in our atmosphere, right? It's being oxidized and removed continuously. And so that new global warming potential scheme would say, you know, it's not about taking methane to zero like we have to with fossil carbon sources. It's more about flattening the emission rate, keeping the emission rate constant or slightly declining will actually have a neutral effect on temperature, right? Because ultimately that's what we care about, is the effect on temperature, not necessarily just the emissions themselves. So getting a better link between what the emissions actually mean to global climate will definitely help this space.
And one quick addition from a corporate point of view, we have our members who've set baselines for their emissions, and they've got reduction targets, and they're trying to work out, as they go towards those targets, how much is down to their management changes, how much is down to grid decarbonisation, how much is down to things like factor changes from IPCC. So the way we deal with it is we retain input data, and we can run that same set of input data through updated versions of the calculation engine. So the corporate can keep tracking against, they can see what's really their changes as opposed to what's changed as a consequence of the system. And I guess that's the driver we're trying to put in place, is to be responsible for what you can manage and accept there will be some things going up and down in the background.
Carlos.
Hi, Carlos from WWF. I think we're facing a huge problem, and I think one approach is for us to split the problems in smaller pieces so we can address them differently. So when you look at the total greenhouse gas emissions of cattle in the world based on the FAO reports, it's a very alarming number. But when you look, for instance, the emissions of US, it's a much lower number, right? And that's why, because US is specializing in producing beef. But in the FAO numbers, you have countries like India, Pakistan, where you have a lot of idle cattle. And maybe the problems to address the emissions of that type of cattle are totally different than the solutions to address emissions in US. So my question is there any analysis or any study being done in looking at the total emissions of specialized beef herds versus emissions from idle cattle or cattle that is used for traction or for other things that are not specialized beef production? If you guys believe that this should be even an approach, you know, that the GRSB should take.
It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because as we learned, Rory made the point yesterday, we're often assessed as an industry using these global figures. But how do we break that down into, well, this is actually beef production versus cows kept for a range of other reasons?
Yeah. I think it would be pretty difficult, wouldn't it? Because you'd have to make assumptions about which countries have commercial operations. And obviously within India, and well, probably not India, but different countries, there are going to be commercial sides. So each country will be reporting under what their emissions are related to livestock. So you could make some assumptions there, but it's probably a bit of a risky road, is my
Yeah, it is broken down in like per country. So you can see that the emissions from India are much higher than they are from North America, for example. But another approach is actually to, rather than narrow it, to actually broaden it and look at the ecosystem services as a whole. So where you attach a value to a animal that's older in India, but where it may be used for a draft, and it has value there for that reason in India, but would have no value for that reason in North America. So it's a matter of basically assigning value to the animal for the traits that it delivers within the society that it's located.
Yeah.
Pablo.
Yes. I work in conserving grasslands. And when we remove some forest and then we plant trees, we recover part of the biodiversity. But when we plant trees in a grassland, we bring some part of the biodiversity from the forests, but we lose the more endangered birds, for example, which are of the grasslands. So I want to know if you are taking this in account, because in Buenos Aires, for example, we are forcing people to plant trees and losing the most endangered part of the biodiversity of the grasslands.
Fabiana?
It's a good question. When we are talking integrated systems in Brazil, and to put trees into the pastures, we are talking about that 30% that haven't trees, because we have a 65 to 68% of Brazil conserved with the forestry, with the native forestry. So when we reintroduce the trees into the pastures, we are not losing the biodiversity of the grassland, because we don't have rangelands. We don't have native species. We have only on the most of the part of Brazil, in the most of the part of the production systems, in the grass-fed beef production, we have exotic grass that are brachyia and panicum. And so we reintroduce the biodiversity and not lose the biodiversity in this case.
What about if someone in the south of Brazil, in the Pampa Gaúcho, wants to plant trees? Would you say no?
No, because Pampa and Pantanal, it's it's another point of view. We don't recommend to put exotic trees into Pantanal and into rangelands on the Pampas, because they have a typical system there that it's going well. And we are talking about the savanna region that is Cerrado, and the Amazon legal. That's not the Amazon forest, but it's the border of the Amazon.
And what about Colombia?
Yeah, maybe I should add that I think it depends very much on the situation that you find when you start. So you have to see that we did very detailed case studies, 6 in Colombia in different areas on different production systems, and the data that we have on biodiversity where the biodiversity did not get worse. In most of the cases, it improved in terms of, like we heard, some of these species like dung beetles and the implications for soil, as well as birds and things. But I'm not an expert, but the data that CPAF provided us for this was not showing a degradation of biodiversity in this. And I think, I just want to make a more general comment. I think we should not... while we were doing case studies, we should not actually think that we have the one-fits-all solution. The reason why we do case studies is because it's the only way to really have a very comprehensive consideration of everything, including economics, which has been missing quite a bit. So we added this to this analysis. But the systems that we analyzed are definitely not a blueprint for the rest of the world, like Pip mentioned. But I believe that the principles that we find in our research and in the conclusions, they apply to many more locations and countries and farming situations, but then the implementation of a change or improvement, let's say, that probably looks very different. And as I mentioned, the biodiversity, if I start setting land free with this, which is the nice thing in the South American cases that we analyze, then the biodiversity in this land that I manage might decrease, but then I have an opportunity to increase biodiversity elsewhere.
I think, can I just add to that? I mean, to me, it kind of highlights some of the risks that questions of a narrow focus on carbon, and I think you've always got to look at the interconnectedness of all the systems, and certainly in our Australian framework, we kind of set up the balance of tree and grass cover, and that's really recognising the importance of grassland systems as well, and the important biodiversity sides there. So, I mean, my personal view is we've got carbon markets at the moment, and I think a lot of particular corporates that are buying the carbon are promoting more the biodiversity side. And I think once we can figure out how to value biodiversity, to me, it makes sense that it would switch around, that you have the biodiversity markets, and then you've got the co-benefits, really, of carbon coming through.
Yeah, quantifying biodiversity has been a big obstacle. Like, we have the CO2 equivalents for all the greenhouse gas, and that's why there's been so much focus in that area. But putting numbers on biodiversity, like what's a species worth, how do you quantify that within different ecosystems globally? It's very challenging to come up with the approaches to do that. And I think we you know, what we're doing now within LEAP is we definitely need different approaches for global versus regional versus local in terms of how those are approached.
Claus, in your project, you mentioned that the outcome, and we tend to see this quite often in the more intensive, more productive systems, the regenerative systems that lead to high levels of sequestration, that you actually see higher net emissions per hectare, but less per kilogram of beef.
Yeah.
Tim, the world needs less emissions. How do we deal with that? And often what we hear when we talk about improvements in footprints around beef is that we've reduced emissions, but what we've done is reduced intensity. How do we communicate that? Because externally, the comparison that's being made is complete emissions from cattle versus pork, chicken, or as a proportion of total emissions.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and you add, Tim, or you make the main point. Yeah, I mean, it always depends on the reference unit that you use. So you use total emissions from cattle. If you keep the total emissions from cattle, but under that you produce much more beef, you reduce the per kilogram emissions. If you change on a particular farm the system, as I said, to a more, I don't want to use this word intensive because it's simply not defined. Everybody uses it, extensive and intensive, but as an economist I'm always afraid of this. So I say, that's why I said higher stocking rates. That's an indicator I can measure. And that's very clear. So on that land with a higher stocking rate, I have, of course, more emissions. But the net emissions from that farm of the 100 hectares where I converted 20 hectares into something higher stocking rate is probably is the same or even a bit less. And on a per kilogram basis, it would be the same unless I increase the production on this farm a little bit. But then I create carbon sinks on that other land. And that changes the equation.
Yeah, basically any kind of activity leads to more emissions, right? So when I'm asked that question, I usually, if we look at, there's some talk about the alternative protein sources and the people that are pushing towards Meatless Monday and all of these other initiatives. But when we do the overall projections, we're still projecting that the consumption of beef is going to increase globally. Those are the facts. And if that's the reality, and we think food is important and beef is going to be part of the food that humanity consumes, then I think as an industry we have an obligation to try to do that as efficiently as possible. And in order to do that, that's why we need the metric of per kilogram of beef production in order to measure that and deal with that as a whole.
Any other questions? Well, any other questions? On that point that there is an understanding that we all need to eat. We all need some degree of leather for fibre and so on. So there is there is a need to have and understand the impacts that come with the food system are somewhat inevitable. When we look at the portfolio of emissions that are associated to beef, land use change and TERIC emissions, what are some of those that potentially do need to be stopped? Or, you know, from a ethical, biodiversity, planetary point of view, does deforestation fit into that spot where, you know, as an impact in the food system, something we could move forward, and what impact would that have on emissions?
So is your question, should we stop deforestation?
Well,
I think that's, yes.
What is the breakout?
Yeah.
What is the breakup? You know, and in the US, it doesn't break up, but in Australia, in the footprint analysis and the pathways moving forward, deforestation is obviously a key part of that.
To our, so it obviously has a big role to play in cutting overall emissions, is to reduce deforestation or eliminate.
And are there other, you know, in the work you guys have done in LCAs, are there other things that you see, you know, might be small parts of it, but things we could move forward, or there's technologies being developed, the seaweed, for example, that might be game changers in some of those areas?
Yeah, so I think there's lots of little things that we can do to keep moving down that path that we've kind of been on. But as has been mentioned, essentially the biggest driver the last 40, 50 years has been productivity, right? And actually doing more with less in terms of producing more beef with fewer feed resources, shortening the time to slaughter, having larger animals, right? Animal reproduction is really, really important, right? Not having open cows out on the landscape, non-pregnant animals. It's those little things from a management perspective that will probably always have more of an impact than like the next fancy technology that's coming down the line. And also when we evaluate a lot of these systems, we need to think about other unintended consequences, right? We may be able to reduce enteric methane, but maybe we create a situation in the full supply chain where we're increasing carbon emissions someplace else, right? Or increasing nitrogen emissions. So it is really important to not get too down in the weeds and look at just one part of the supply chain, because we may be missing other ripple effects that we're causing when we do make a change.
Simon, have there any been key interventions that have come out in farmers using the tool that have had the biggest impact?
I think feed would be the one which would sort of jump out to me. Obviously linked to deforestation. If someone's buying in imported soy in our tool, that has a big sort of penalty because there's assumed land use change with it. And then looking from our work on the crop side, we know that there's a big range in efficiency and productivity in crop production. So if you can apply those efficiencies, it might be min-till, it might be using cover crops, it might be using the right fertilizers at the right levels. If you can do all that on the feed side, which is then used for finishing whatever, that does reduce and flow through to the beef or the milk product at the end.
We've got one more question. Another one, Carlos.
Yeah, Carlos from WWF again. I think you mentioned here about the seaweed. So a lot of the discussion has been around the things that we can do outside of the rumen. And what are the new exciting science or technologies that we could apply inside of the rumen, changing the bacteria and changing how they behave so we can reduce, methane emissions?
Well, I can probably answer some of that. Yeah. So the most effective way to lower methane emissions now on a per kilogram beef is to feed grain diets. That will, out of all the technologies we have, that's the one that I'm not aware of any measurements that have ever made where that has not shown that lowers methane emissions. In terms of additives, probably the most promising one that's now still not on the market, but that's going through the commercialization and the regulatory process right now is 3-nitrooxypropanol, which is a DSM product that's now in research trials. That's the one that's probably the closest to market. It still has to go through the regulatory process, and that's a somewhat unknown process. So what the outcome of that will be is still not clear. And then there's a lot of other items like the seaweed was mentioned, condensed tannins within forages, but a lot of it is focused around improving diet quality. But the limitation of a lot of those additives is that they still are very difficult to deliver where the emissions are the highest, which is in our cow herds in the rangeland situation. As we know, as producers, administering additives out on range is a very challenging thing. Even getting mineral into animals can be challenging, and mineral is not really an adequate carrier either for any of those additives, because there's a tremendous variation in the intake between individual animals within a pasture situation. So that's still a big obstacle that we're facing. Probably the most promising technology that was hopefully going to solve that problem was around the work that the New Zealanders were doing on vaccination against methanogens. But that's still at a science stage. It's not close to commercialization at all at this point.
Question at the back.
Yeah, Graham Finn from Canadian Roundtable. From what numbers I know, there's 930 million sheep and goats in the world and 1.4 billion cattle. Is anyone doing studies on sheep and goat? They're still farting.
So it is out the front end of the animal, whether it's a small ruminant or a large ruminant animal. For sure, I think there's a lot of, we kind of heard that at the top, right? The 14.5% number for all livestock, and then we're talking about beef. There's lots of conflation that happens, right? That's a total livestock number globally. If you look at the percent from that FAO report, it's about 6% for beef specifically globally, but we don't hear that number at all when we talk about it, right? We use the big number, the 14.5. And that 6% accounts for, deforestation, which is a significant portion of that 6%. So that, to your point, there are other species. There's also crop agriculture, which I don't know what the percent is for that. For some reason, they don't get called out as a percentage globally, right?
Can you explain the 6%? Because the paper calls out 65% of it from cattle, 65% of the 14.
So I'm sure that you can split it a few different ways. Speaking of allocation, right? You can split it between the animals themselves, like these are beef cattle versus dairy cattle, by the product, right? There's different ways that can get broken out. But it's about 6% and 3% beef dairy. And together that would be about 9% of global emissions, if that makes sense.
Oh, okay, yeah. So 9% of the 14. So
9% of global emissions, which is, I can't do the math.
65%.
yeah. And I just want to make one other point. We're talking about methane, and speaking of the talk that was yesterday from Rabobank, talking about a value proposition, I think we also had to talk about the positives of ruminant animals and the value that they bring to our food system. Yes, they emit methane, but all those cattle, sheep, and goats, for the most part, they're all adding to the human protein supply, adding protein that would not exist without them because they're converting human inedible feeds and grass to protein. And so I think we need to talk about some of that as well, not just how do we become less bad, but talk about, again, our value proposition that we bring.
And economics, social development.
Absolutely, all those things.
Yeah, and I would add the other thing is the forage component, which is huge in all beef cattle production systems, even in Canada's, which is largely seen as a feedlot-based production system. When you look at our herd as a whole, about 80% of the feed that we feed in our system is forage. So even in North American systems, there's a big part of forage is a big part of the equation, and that's a feed source that no other livestock can utilize.
Justin, if we can do this in 2 minutes, I'll get a thumbs up from Sarah.
Well, the question's to you, Ian. So I appreciate the crack panel's perspective, but you asked them a question just before about what would you stop, what would you focus on. I wonder if you can share with us from a Green Group point of view, how do you think about the same question, or how do you think the Green Movement thinks about the same question? A lot of us are feeling the pressure from advocacy groups on the industry, and I wonder if there's anything you can share from that perspective. What do you think the Green Movement might be focused on within this industry?
Certainly from an environmental perspective, it is the unattributable costs to the outcome that the food provides. So if a food is producing nutrient-dense protein, and it's doing that and economic and social development in places, but doing that through deforestation, or could continue to do that, and reduce the cost of something like deforestation, then that's something we would prefer to see out. Remove deforestation, but allow the product then at a lower cost to provide all those outcomes. The same is true of water quality in places like the Great Barrier Reef, biodiversity on extensive farms, etc. Where the environmental groups often also work, obviously, is in consumption. And what role does a sustainable diet play in creating demand for or allowing a more sustainable level of cattle production in places where impacts are high or where that demand is driving pressure to deforest? Green groups will continue to work on consumption around sustainable diets, more recently and more commonly linked to dietary guidelines, purely because it's unethical to suggest someone eat something that is not good for them. And that will continue. I guess, to Sarah's point, the more we can make beef a sustainable option in the middle of that plate, and we've had this discussion in Australia around carbon neutral beef, it would be hard to suggest, because carbon neutrality would come with a level of biodiversity and vegetation management, although within the context of Pablo's question, it would be hard to suggest there would be a more sustainable or positive product in the middle of a plate if we could achieve such goals. Time's up. So, and nobody gets to have a rebuttal. Very nice. We're now moving on to lunch. So, again, lunch in the restaurant, Sara, where it was yesterday. For those of you who have got friends in other panels, promote this one. Tell them to come over with some hard questions. Thank you very much.